Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about an author whose works I've kind of just been attacking or reading quite a lot of in one go, partly as part of Fitzhuary, which Kieran over at Katie Books, Sina over at Beating Around the Books, and a few others have been kind of doing as a sort of little challenge to ourselves to read a few more books from Fitzcarraldo Press. And an author who I'd been wanting to read for a while and had kept on hearing loads of buzz around had been Annie Ernaux, and she is the author I want to talk about a little bit today. So I think this month I've read 5 of her books, and that sounds like a lot more than it is, but given that like many of them are tiny, like little sort of 70-80 page books, it's maybe not as much as that directly sounds, but I really want to talk about her work because I've just found her such an interesting and dynamic author who has just so many things to say, and I really want to check out even more of hers as well. So Annie Ernaux is a French writer, mostly known, it seems, for The Years, which has sort of been translated in sort of more recent years and was shortlisted for the International Booker. Again, there's going to be a connection to the Booker somewhere. But she is just an author that is so interesting because she's sort of a memoirist and sort of diarist almost, and has this really sort of strong focus on watching history almost as an observer, but also inserting little bits of her own stories into it. And what I find so fascinating about the way she approaches all of this is that there is often this narrative style of using she to describe herself in the book rather than an I. And she's very intentional in many of her books that I've seen so far in talking about that and in kind of saying, to use I feels like sort of dominating the conversation too much and inserting myself too much. To use a you or a they or one or whatever feels too informal and too away from everything else. And so she kind of goes for the she, but then often, particularly in a book like The Years, uses this we as a really interesting technique. And this is something that really drew me to this. So The Years is, as the sort of title seems to suggest, a sort of long look over sort of the years of sort of history and particularly her sort of lifetime. But the sweeping we that she uses is so interesting in this book because it allows her to talk about how France and how the world started to view or react or behave in a certain way, but also kind of both implicate herself in it, but also sometimes step back from it. And that's something that I absolutely loved. And so, for example, in this book, the we kind of starts to look at, for example, things like after 9/11, there's sort of the rising tide of Islamophobia and fascism. And so she is very aware that the sort of tide of politics changing is something that, although she doesn't necessarily subscribe to being Islamophobic or fascistic or whatever, she realizes that she's part of a society that is. And so that we is employed really powerfully in that. And I thought this book was stunning. I think it's a memoir, it's sort of an historical trip through French history. It's a very personal story at times. It kind of, and this is probably also why it ended up being, it was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize, a prize that is typically for, short stories and fiction. And, it's meant to be a fiction prize, and yet something that's non-fiction made it, partly because of the strength of this book alone, but also because it has a sort of personal novel-like feel to it that I just absolutely adored. So yeah, I loved this, as you may be able to tell. And but I also really enjoyed a few of her others. So I'll sort of, in many ways, The Years feels like a bit of a greatest hits compilation for some of the shorter books. And I don't mean that as an insult at all. What often happens is because The Years is such a sweeping period of history, she'll mention little moments. And then in these books, they will go into a little bit more detail. So for example, in Happening, she talks a lot about her own relationship with her body, and particularly to abortion and to sex. And it's a really powerful and quite haunting book at times because there is this almost kind of curious detachment in using she, where she can really feel a lot of empathy for her past self, but also sort of is seeing it in a wider political or wider field of understanding. And it's really powerful and beautifully done. You also have, for example, A Girl's Story, which talks about her first experiences of sex and of relationships. And so again, these two books, both Happening and A Girl's Story, kind of go and sit alongside each other in a really interesting way that says quite a lot. But then we also move on to things like A Man's Place, which talks a lot about her relationship with her father, and particularly how his death affected her. And all of that is dealt with in a really small amount of pages, but is really quite beautiful and haunting. Like, she talks a lot about kind of going through exam season and sort of being so stressed about that she almost doesn't think about her father, and all of these sorts of things, and the guilt that's wrapped up with that. And I just found it really quite profound. And one that I actually just loved, probably almost the most, I think this in the years works really well for me, was Exteriors. And this again kind of picks up on some of that other sort of stuff I was talking about earlier, of her looking at being an outsider, what it means to be an outsider, how we treat outsiders critically as a society. And so she delves again into Islamophobia and fascism, and what the far right means in France in the modern day, what it used to mean, how it's sort of grown and changed, all of these sorts of things. And so I think this title is a really interesting and clever one, because the idea of sort of all of the kind of exteriors, in terms of all these people who are outside, who are pushed to the exterior, you know, the furthest out parts of Paris, for example, like the furthest banlieue. And then also exteriors in terms of these small little details that are seemingly unimportant, that she picks up on and is really acute at looking at. Last month I also read A Simple Passion by her, which was the tale of an affair, and I also have a few others that I really want to read of hers, so Shame and some others. But I think just as a body of work, I'm hoping that kind of conveys just how brilliant Annie Ernaux is, or at least how much I really loved her work. I think it's so interesting because it's sort of social observation, it's this really detailed look at what it means to exist in the modern day, how things have changed so quickly, and also just a real insight into these inner thoughts of her and other people as they age. And you know, apparently hers is a name that's been floated a few times for things like the Nobel Prize for Literature. I think rightly so, based on these books. I've just absolutely loved reading them, and I think it's so interesting when you get someone like Annie Ernaux, because she sort of stands out so much for me versus sort of a lot of other literature, really combining and blending forms. Just the idea that you kind of got these memoirs, but maybe they're not memoirs, maybe they're sort of novels, maybe they're historical documents, you know, it's a bit of everything. And her kind of candidness and honesty in talking about her relationships and her troubles is so powerfully done, but never feels exploitative. It never feels like she's calling up some sort of old friend and being like, well, you never guess what Betty did in 1972. I mean, I hope that I want to read that book now, actually. But apparently she has got some other books that are not out in translation yet. And my plan at some point is, I've also got the French version of Happening, L'Événement, to try and read at some point, which I really want to do, just to kind of try and read it in the original. My French is maybe not good enough for that. We'll see how that goes. It might be horrendous, but nonetheless, I'm really enjoying this. And also, you know, as it is Fitzgerald, I should say, you know, it's great to see a publisher like Fitzgerald Press really picking up on an author like this and really making sure that her work is accessible to an English audience. And I mean, I will see when I read the French version of Happening, but the translations to me, just these felt so crystal clear. There was a real voice that was captured in the writing, despite it being in translation, and that's kind of impressive as well. So I hope you do check her out. Are there any books that I've not mentioned from this that you'd like to hear about, or that you want to recommend from Annie Ernaux? I've been Bob the Bookerer. Take care, and I'll see you all soon. All right, bye-bye.